The dust rose first, before the sound of hooves, before the shouting, before the white fabric appeared against the trees. People in the town felt it under their feet, a faint vibration traveling through dirt roads and wooden porches. Chickens scattered. Dogs went silent. A man standing outside the barber shop stopped mid-sentence and looked down, as if the ground itself had whispered a warning. This wasn't the first time danger had come close, but it was the first time it came this loud. By the time the riders were visible, the count was already spreading through the town in fragments. Hundreds, no more, close to 1,000. No one knew exactly who said the number first. It didn't matter. The fear attached itself instantly, heavy and undeniable. 1,000 KK members were riding toward a black town that wasn't supposed to survive another year. The strange thing was what didn't happen next. No screams, no running crowds, no barricades slammed together in panic. Instead, doors closed quietly, windows were covered carefully, and the church bell rang once, only once, then stopped. That single bell wasn't a call for prayer. It was a signal. This town had a name, but outsiders rarely used it. On maps it appeared faded, half-legible, as if someone had tried to erase it without fully committing. To nearby white towns it was that place down the road. To the men riding in white robes it was an insult, a reminder that black people could build something without permission. It had started decades earlier, after the Civil War, when formerly enslaved families drifted toward cheap land no one else wanted. Swamp edges, clay-heavy soil, flood-prone valleys, places dismissed as worthless. But worthless land meant freedom from watching eyes. They built homes with hands that had survived chains. They laid streets unevenly, because perfection wasn't the goal, survival was. A school went up first, then a church, then a general store. By the time white officials noticed, the town was already functioning. And that was the problem. The KKK didn't just hate individuals. They hated proof. Proof that fear wasn't permanent. Proof that control could slip. For years the pressure came quietly. Banks refused loans. Merchants stopped delivering supplies. County officials lost paperwork. Then came the warnings. A cross burned at the edge of town one night, far enough away to be deniable, close enough to be understood. A black farmer was beaten on a road just outside city limits. A teacher received a letter with no return address, only a date written inside. The message was consistent: leave, or else. But the town stayed. And that's what turned threats into plans. At dawn on the day the riders came, the town woke earlier than usual. Not because of fear, because of preparation. Men moved between houses without speaking. Women packed items that looked ordinary but weren't. Children were kept inside, instructed not to look out windows no matter what they heard. If you'd walked through the streets that morning, you might have thought nothing unusual was happening. That was the point. Behind closed doors, the town was transforming itself. Boards were loosened, not nailed tighter. Windows were left slightly ajar, not sealed shut. Lanterns were placed where they could be knocked over easily. None of it looked like defense. It looked like negligence. And negligence was exactly what the riders expected. The first KKK members reached the outer edge of town just before noon. They slowed immediately, not because of resistance, because of confusion. They were used to towns reacting one of two ways: open panic or stiff, obvious defense. Either way, fear announced itself. Here, there was nothing. No men standing guard. No weapons visible. No one shouting insults or begging. Just silence. A few riders dismounted, scanning the buildings. One kicked at the dirt, unimpressed. "Ghost town," someone muttered. Another laughed. Ran off like they always do. But something about the place felt wrong. The streets were too clean. The doors too orderly. The silence too deliberate. Fear usually leaves mess behind. This place looked ready. As more riders poured in, their confidence returned. They spread out, occupying intersections, leaning against fences, laughing loudly to reclaim the sound. A few dismounted near the church. Others headed toward the store. That's when the first thing happened. A horse screamed. Not a whinny, a full, panicked scream. It reared violently, throwing its rider into the dirt. The animal bolted, crashing into another horse, which spooked and pulled its tether loose. Shouting erupted. The rider scrambled up, furious, demanding to know what scared the animal. No one answered, because no one could see it. Only later would they understand that the ground near the well had been treated with a mixture of oil and crushed plants that burned the hooves, invisible, painful, terrifying to animals trained for. It wasn't lethal. It was chaos. While riders were distracted, doors opened elsewhere. Not wide, just enough. Children, small, quiet, trained, rolled glass marbles into the streets. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They scattered into cracks and low points in the road. Horses stepped, slipped, fell. Men shouted. Animals panicked. The formation dissolved. Still no gunfire. No visible attackers. Just accidents. Too many accidents. At the edge of town, another group of riders attempted to regroup near a cluster of storage buildings. That's when the fire started. Not an explosion. Not an inferno. Just smoke. Thick, choking smoke poured from behind the buildings, rolling low across the ground, stinging eyes and lungs. Horses panicked again, pulling against reins, trying to escape something they couldn't see. The smoke wasn't random. It was timed. Wind direction mattered. The town had been watching the sky for days. Some riders finally drew weapons. That was the moment everything shifted. Because now they weren't just intimidating a town. They were surrounded by one. From windows that had seemed empty, eyes appeared. From rooftops, shadows moved. From alleys, shapes stepped forward, not charging, not screaming, just present. Men, women, older boys, not armed like soldiers, armed like people who knew their environment. The riders realized something too late. This town wasn't unguarded. It was prepared. A horn sounded. Not loud, but sharp. It echoed once, then stopped. And suddenly, every street light went out. The riders had planned to terrify people in daylight. They hadn't planned for night to arrive early. Smoke thickened. Horses screamed again. Someone fired a shot, wild, panicked, and the sound bounced unpredictably off buildings, making it impossible to tell where it came from. Fear finally arrived. But it wasn't wearing white robes. Men began shouting orders that no one followed. Groups broke apart. Riders collided with each other, trying to escape narrow streets they no longer understood. They had memorized this town from the outside. They never walked it from within. Every turn felt wrong. Every shadow looked like movement. Every noise felt intentional. And for the first time that day, the KKK realized something deeply unsettling. They weren't in control of this situation. They were inside it. Somewhere near the center of town, a single figure stood in the open. Not hiding, not attacking, just standing. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a weapon. He waited. As riders passed him in panic, none stopped. None challenged him. Because something about his stillness felt more dangerous than violence. He wasn't afraid. And fear had always been their strongest weapon. By late afternoon, the riders began leaving, not retreating in formation, not declaring victory or defeat. They fled, in clusters, in ones and twos, looking over shoulders. They carried no trophies. They burned no buildings. They left behind injured horses, dropped weapons, torn robes. And most importantly, they left behind certainty. When the dust finally settled, the town emerged. People stepped into the streets, slowly, cautiously, listening for sounds that didn't come. Children were brought outside. Doors opened fully. Smoke drifted away. No bodies littered the roads. No blood stained the dirt. But the message was unmistakable. This town would not be erased easily. And the KKK would never speak of what happened here the way they spoke of other places. Because there was no story of domination to tell. Only silence. And silence, when it spreads among men who rely on fear, is more dangerous than any gun. This was only the beginning. The riders didn't stop running when they crossed the town's edge. They kept going long after the last house disappeared behind the trees, long after the dirt road narrowed into something barely fit for hooves. Men who had arrived laughing now rode with hunched shoulders, robes pulled tight around faces that refused to look back. No one spoke, because speaking meant admitting what had just happened. And none of them were ready to name it. By nightfall, rumors were already mutating. In the nearby white towns, men claimed the rally had been called off. Others said the black town had been empty. A few insisted the riders had simply lost interest. But those who were there told a different story in fragments, always lowering their voices, always changing details. They spoke of shadows moving without sound, of streets that twisted when they shouldn't have, of horses that refused commands, as if the ground itself had turned hostile. They never spoke of bravery. They spoke of confusion, and confusion was worse, because fear can be confronted. Confusion eats at you later. Back in the town, there was no celebration, no cheers, no speeches. People gathered quietly in the church as lanterns were lit again. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and crushed earth. Children slept against their mothers' shoulders. Men leaned against walls, exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscle. They had won something, but no one pretended it was over. Because standing up to the KKK once didn't end their hatred. It announced something far more dangerous: resistance. The elders spoke first. Not loudly, not dramatically. They reminded everyone why the plan had worked. Because no single person had tried to be a hero. Because no one had acted alone. Because the town had moved like a single body, quietly, patiently, deliberately. This wasn't revenge. It was refusal. Refusal to panic. Refusal to perform fear. Refusal to die on someone else's schedule. And refusal, they knew, was contagious. Within days, consequences arrived. Not riders. Paper. County inspectors appeared, suddenly concerned about zoning violations. A bank froze accounts without explanation. The railroad announced delays that only affected this route. Pressure, once again, took quieter forms. But now the town recognized it. They documented everything. They shared information. They prepared responses before threats arrived. And something unexpected happened. Other towns began sending messages. Not openly, not officially. A farmer from 2 counties over asked how they'd handled intimidation. A preacher wrote asking how to keep people from fleeing. A teacher wanted to know how to protect children without teaching them fear. The town replied carefully. They didn't describe tactics. They described mindset. The KK noticed. That scared them more than the ambush. Because violence works best in isolation. And isolation was breaking. Meetings grew more aggressive. Leaders demanded answers. Fingers pointed inward. Someone accused someone else of cowardice. Another blamed bad planning. Another insisted they should have burned the town and accepted the fallout. But that argument exposed something dangerous. Burning the town would have proved it mattered. And now even their enemies were watching. Months later, a new rally was proposed. Smaller, more controlled. It never happened. Too many men declined to attend. Too many horses refused to load calmly. Too many remembered the silence. The town remained. Still under pressure, still targeted, but no longer invisible. Years later, historians would struggle to categorize what happened. There was no massacre, no famous battle, no named leader to credit. Just a town that refused to behave the way it was expected to. And that refusal changed to math. Because power depends on predictability. And that day, predictability died. Even decades later, older men in nearby counties would pause mid-sentence when the town's name came up. They wouldn't curse it. They wouldn't mock it. They'd simply fall quiet, as if remembering something they still didn't understand. As if remembering the day fear arrived and chose the wrong side. This was not the end. It was the moment everything shifted. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with headlines or gunfire or declarations. It arrived in behavior. Men who once rode openly now avoided certain roads. Meetings that had been weekly became irregular. New recruits stopped showing up with the same enthusiasm. Fear hadn't vanished. It had changed direction. Inside the town, life resumed, but not the way it had before. People still worked the fields. Children still went to school. Church bells still rang on Sundays. But beneath the routine, something sharper existed. Awareness. Every stranger was noted. Every rumor was weighed. Every small decision was made with collective memory in mind. They had learned something irreversible. They were not helpless, and knowing that was dangerous knowledge, the elders adjusted their approach. They discouraged boasting. They warned against stories growing too dramatic. They understood that myth-making could provoke retaliation. So they emphasized discipline, strength without display, confidence without noise. If the KKK wanted spectacle, the town would give them nothing to feed on. No panic, no defiance parades, no symbolic gestures that invited punishment. Only calm refusal. But outside the town, imagination filled the gaps. White newspapers hinted at unusual resistance. Lawmen dismissed it as exaggeration, but their eyes lingered longer on maps. Whispers spread about traps, about armed militias, about secret alliances. None of it was true, which made it more effective, because uncertainty multiplies fear faster than facts ever could. The KKK leadership attempted damage control. They released statements mocking the incident. They framed it as a logistical issue. They blamed weather, roads, poor coordination. But internally, panic crept in. Because if one black town could disrupt a force of 1,000 without firing a shot, what else was possible? The most dangerous outcome wasn't that the town had resisted. It was that others might try the same. An imitation was a threat they couldn't control. A year passed. Then 2. The town remained under watch but untouched. No mass arrests, no raids, no public retaliation, which confused everyone. Because hate groups thrive on escalation. And here, escalation had failed. Children grew older knowing the story, but not as legend, as instruction. They were taught where to stand, when to stay silent, how to observe without being seen. They learned that courage wasn't shouting back. It was holding the line together. Much later, a historian would write that the town outwitted the KKK. That wasn't accurate. They hadn't outsmarted hate. They had refused to perform fear for it. And hate, stripped of fear, loses its audience. Long after the last rally was canceled and the last robe folded away, the lesson remained. Power expects obedience. Terror expects reaction. And sometimes the most devastating response is neither. Just unity. Just patience. Just a town that decided it would not move. Years later, outsiders would still ask the same question. How did a town with no weapons, no army, no political power stop 1,000 men who lived on intimidation? They expected a clever trick, a secret plan, a hidden ally. What they got instead was something quieter. The truth was uncomfortable. The town had studied fear the way others studied law. They knew how it moved. They knew how it fed. They knew when it grew reckless. And they understood one thing better than their enemies ever did. Fear collapses when it can't tell who is afraid. There was no single hero. No dramatic last stand. No speech that turned the tide. There were meetings in kitchens. Signals passed through hymns. Warnings hidden in routine conversations. Ordinary acts synchronized. That was the strategy. The KKK never admitted defeat. They simply stopped coming. And when hatred retreats without explanation, it leaves a vacuum filled with doubt. Doubt eats movements from the inside. New generations inherited the town, unaware at first of how close it once came to erasure. But the habits remained. Community over spectacle, silence over panic, togetherness over fear, not because they expected another rally, but because they knew history repeats itself when vigilance fades. The town still stands. Not famous, not celebrated, not preserved in monuments, but alive, which, considering what once came for it, is the most powerful ending possible. And that's the part no one expected. They never wrote this part down. No records, no plaques, no anniversary speeches. Because survival in that town was never treated like a victory parade. It was treated like a discipline. After the rally that never became what it was supposed to be, something strange happened. The KKK didn't escalate. They didn't retaliate. They didn't come back louder. They fractured. Quietly. Men who had arrived unified by hatred went home, divided by suspicion. Who leaked information? Who hesitated? Who panicked first? Movements built on intimidation cannot survive unanswered questions, especially when those questions point inward. The town felt the shift before they saw it. Phone calls stopped. Letters stopped. Eyes that once lingered too long now looked away. Hate doesn't vanish overnight, but it does lose confidence. And confidence was the only real weapon it ever had. Life returned to something resembling normal. Children walked to school without escorts. Church services returned to routine sermons. Shop owners stopped counting footsteps outside after sunset. But no one relaxed. Not fully, because they understood something outsiders didn't. Peace earned through vigilance is fragile. The elders made a decision then. They would not tell the story as a warning. They would live it as a system. Every newcomer learned the same unspoken rules. Know your neighbor. Notice patterns. Share information quietly. Never let fear isolate you. And above all, never let your enemy decide the tempo. Years later, historians would argue over numbers. Was it really 1,000? Were they truly organized? Did the threat get exaggerated? The town never corrected anyone, because numbers were irrelevant. Fear doesn't measure crowds. It measures silence, and silence was the one thing the town never gave them. Not shouting, not protesting, not confrontation. Presence, consistency. Community that refused to fracture. What the KKK expected was resistance they could crush. What they encountered was something far more dangerous. A place where intimidation failed to land. Where threats echoed back unanswered. Where fear had no audience. That's how the town won. Not by fighting harder, but by denying hate its oxygen. And that lesson traveled. Quietly, from town to town, from generation to generation, from people who would never call themselves heroes, because heroes demand recognition, and survival, real survival, never does. It just keeps going, and sometimes that's enough. They never put a marker on the edge of town. No sign that said this is where it happened. Because memory, when weaponized, attracts the wrong kind of attention. Instead, they let the lesson sink into routines. Years passed. The men who once arrived in robes grew older, quieter, irrelevant. Some pretended they had never been there. Some convinced themselves they had been misled. Some carried the shame privately, where it couldn't infect anyone else. Hate ages badly when it isn't fed. The town changed, but not the way outsiders expected. It didn't become loud. It didn't become symbolic. It didn't turn itself into a headline. It became efficient. When rumors surfaced, they traveled faster than fear. When outsiders asked too many questions, answers stayed vague. When threats appeared indirect, responses appeared invisible. Nothing dramatic. Nothing reactive. Just readiness. Children grew up hearing fragments. Not speeches. Fragments. Stories told while fixing fences. Warnings disguised as jokes. Advice folded into everyday chores. Stay observant. Trust patterns, not promises. Never assume danger announces itself. And most importantly, strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Decades later, journalists tried to reconstruct the moment. They wanted a leader, a mastermind, a heroic speech. They found none. What they found instead was a community that refused to fracture under pressure. And that confused them, because history prefers faces. But this story had none. What the KKK failed to understand and never would was this: power only works when people believe it's inevitable. The moment inevitability breaks, fear collapses. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. That town didn't defeat 1,000 men. They defeated the assumption that intimidation always wins. And once that assumption died, everything else followed. No monuments were raised. No anniversaries held. Just a town that kept living. Together, unimpressed by threats, uninterested in myths, and fully aware that survival, when done right, leaves no evidence, except the fact that you're still here.